What's up everybody, it's your boy Nate. So today we're going to be doing a deep dive on frame rates, and I know some of you may know of this as FPS or frames per second. Not first person shooters, though video games will probably get brought up at some point in this video. So I really wanted to make this a short video where we just dip our toes into some of these concepts, but if you take a look down at that timeline, you're going to see today we're actually diving in deep, talking all about frame rates, why they matter, which ones you should use, and what are the best standards and practices when determining frame rates. If this is your first time on Black Mixture, we have a whole bunch more tutorials on improving your motion design skills, VFX workflows, and tips and tricks that are going to help save you a lot of time on your next project. So this deep dive on frame rates is just one of the many tutorials and masterclasses we have on the channel that you can check out completely for free from the comfort of your home. All we ask is that you consider smashing that like button and subscribing, or even sending this over to a friend who could just use some help. Anyways, I'm super excited. I know you are too. All right, let's go. So when I first started making animations, years before I ever got into doing commercials or VFX shorts, I honestly had no idea what a frame rate was, what I should even use, and why it even mattered. Now it's been about 12 years, and even though I'm no super cinematography expert, I'd like to think that I know a thing or two about frame rates. So what is a frame rate? Well, whenever you're watching a video, you're actually not watching something that's moving. It may seem like it, but really your mind is experiencing a really dope optical illusion to where it may look like my lips are moving, my hands are moving, but really your brain is just piecing together a series of images, which you can also think of as frames. So yeah, you're actually watching a bunch of pictures just being sent to you one after the other really quickly, and by the time that I'm done with this sentence, you can see just how many frames or how many images you've seen by this counter we have in the corner. So these images are known as frames, and whenever we play them fast enough, it conveys the illusion of movement, but whenever we slow it down like I'm doing right now, the illusion is instantly broken, and you can start to tell because the video looks super choppy. However, once I speed it back up, all of a sudden things look smooth again. And this concept is the basics of every single animation video, whether you're watching that on your computer, your phone, or pretty much any device for that matter. So why does frame rates matter? Well, when you start getting into making animations, shooting films, or even playing video games, your frame rate is going to be your most crucial part of conveying movement. Now, animations can be made at just about any frame rates. A good example of this is looking at a flip book animation where you're not really consciously flipping through, maybe 60 frames per second or anything like that. You're just going, and all of a sudden something that was static on a page is looking like it's moving. However, videos for the most part work on fixed frame rates, and that's because of the old school broadcasting standards, which are NTSC and PAL. Now these standards are dependent on which country you live in, and if you're in an NTSC country, the standard is 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, while if you live in a PAL country, those standard frame rates are going to be 25 frames per second. Here's something super geeky though. Back in the day when television was the main way that people would watch videos, when they switched from black and white video to color video, they actually had to change these standards slightly by 0.1%. So whenever we actually say 24 frames per second, it's really 23.976. Whenever we say 30 frames per second, it's really 29.97, just because of those standards that were set way back in the day, and they've pretty much carried over to digital cameras. Even though most technology isn't constrained to these values anymore, most cameras, like if you're shooting on a Sony or even a Canon, you're gonna see that it's gonna say either 24 or 23.976. It's gonna have these really specific numbers, but that's just because those are the default shooting frame rates that cameras pretty much adopted from the broadcasting standard. Shoot, most movies are actually shot at 24 frames per second, so we even have this connotation of cinema being 24 frames per second. But the main important thing to understand is that videos are displayed at a fixed frame rate, unlike animations and video games, which sometimes vary between their frame rates. Now, in video gaming, most frame rates try to be as high as possible and as consistent as possible, but just because of the technical limitations, sometimes you don't get an even or a super high frame rate. So when you're gaming, you might even see values drop as low as 12 frames per second and then crank all the way up to something like 200 or plus frames a second. And that's just because every image when you game is generated or rendered based on how much work your gaming device has to do. And some intense scenes are going to take more rendering power and thus lower your frame rate, while other scenes are going to be super easy to do, and your system can just crank those frames out super easily, leading to really high frame rates. Now, you may have even heard the term refresh rate get thrown around, which relates directly to a monitor, and the reason for that is because even when you're watching this video, depending on your monitor or whatever device you're using, that's also displaying a series of images, which is measured in hertz, meaning cycles per second. So most monitors by default came at 60 hertz, and then they later on cranked up to 75 hertz as a standard. Nowadays though, you can get a computer or even a phone monitor cranking as high as 120 hertz to even something insane like 500 hertz for a super expensive gaming monitor. Now, none of this matters though if the video comes out at the same frame rate per second, so you could be getting more flashes of the same image per second, and that's just a result of the different technologies having to integrate with each other. So what is a noticeable frame rate? For the most part, frame rates shouldn't be something that you absolutely notice unless they're not really working or integrating properly together. And as a general rule of thumb, your brain typically can piece together 12 to 20 frames per second, more or less as continuous. Anything lower than that and you start to notice some really choppy images and cause eye strain on you. And in fact, since most people nowadays have grown up with televisions that are accustomed to displaying more frames per second than that, even when we go back to showing 12 frames or 20 frames per second, it looks super old school. And that's just because old school cinema, when they had just silent films, those used to be displayed at 16 to 24 frames per second. Nowadays though, technology has advanced to allow our display monitors to be higher frame rates than the video sources that they're given. And yeah, since most of us are accustomed to watching television or starting out watching television and then moving over to maybe a computer monitor, as a society, we're just accustomed to frame rates on the higher end of the spectrum. So yeah, even 12 frames per second will look off to people today. Now, if you've ever played a video game with a lot of movement, things normally look nicely when the frame rates are consistent and high, and whenever they're not, it's pretty annoying and it can make you instantly rage because of the lag. This specific instance happens when the frame rate drops lower than your monitor's refresh rate, and the refresh rate of your monitor is essentially the frame rate of your monitor as well. So what frame rate should you use? Well, that depends on your intended final result mixed with what is technologically possible. Since I make videos, animations, and visual effects, the frame rate I use normally varies depending on the project that I'm working on and also whatever style I'm going for. For example, with animations, I like how different frame rates can convey different illusions of movement. So for a super smooth animation, I can crank things up as high as 60 frames per second, and normally things look super smooth. Or I'll typically work in 24 frames to 30 frames per second just because most content is already made in that frame rate and people are just accustomed to it. But I've also seen a resurgence of low frame rate animations, which give off a more crafty stop motion vibe. So for this Vox style like video we made, some parts of this video were actually made in 12 frames per second just because I wanted it to look like it was a stop motion animation and not just something completely digitally created. As an added benefit, not only did it give it this really cool style, it also allowed me to save a huge amount on the render times because after all, 12 frames per second is much easier to render than 60 frames per second. Now, when I film videos though, I never go to something lower than 24 frames per second because 24 frames per second is considered the standard of cinema. 30 frames per second became something more popular around television time. And nowadays, since YouTube allows me to actually upload videos in 60 frames per second, I figured why not just crank my camera all the way up to 60 frames per second and give you guys the most realistic feeling motion as possible. Now, this does lead to a higher file size because more frames equals more images, which equals even more space taken up on my computer. But hey, I got about I think 10 different hard drives back there, so I'm not really too worried on space. But if you guys are working on a project where you are having to be a little bit space conscious, maybe 60 frames per second is just completely overkill and not really necessary. Now for VFX shots, the frame rate can vary depending on the project, and whenever I'm VFX supervising, I normally try to tell them to make it as high as possible because it's always easier to go down from a higher frame rate to a lower frame rate, but it's not as easy to go from a lower frame rate to something even lower without causing some sort of jarring experience. A really cool example of a visual effect that requires knowledge of frame rates is doing slow motion. So take a look at these two clips here. Here we have one that's shot in 24 frames per second, and here we have one that's shot in 60 frames per second. Now, if I wanted to slow motion this shot, I could just go ahead and change the playback speed to about 50%, but instantly you're gonna notice that the footage that was shot in 24 frames per second looks so much choppier and kind of like it was shot on some sort of security camera or just taking a bunch of photos. Whereas the 60 frames per second footage, I can crank this down and still get a nice continuous smooth motion, since the resulting frame rate is still gonna be higher than 24 frames per second. So yeah, if you guys are trying to shoot some slow motion shots, always go for the higher frame rates, because that's gonna make your footage look so much better when you get down into playing with the timing of it. Now, I know this isn't possible for every single camera to shoot in 60 frames per second, so if you're limited to something like only 24 or 30 frames per second, go with the 30 frames per second, and at least you can crank things down by about 8% and still get a nice smooth cinematic motion without getting this jarring choppy feeling and breaking the illusion of movement. But hey, this was not possible a few years ago, so if you even check out some of our older videos on the channel, most of those are just shot in 24 to even 30 frames per second. And if you guys like mkbhd, you may even notice that all of his videos are shot in 30 frames per second.
24 or 30 FPS?
30.
Okay,
yeah.
There it is.
Yeah. 24 is like your career's fading. Like you're trying to get into movies and some of that. That never works. Kidding. I hope you don't do 24.
I do 30.
Okay.
Okay, so that is it about frame rates, and I want you guys to give yourself a pat on the back because you sat through learning all the super technicals like the standards of NTSC and PAL and the 23.976 frames per second, all the way down into the more conceptual aspects of frame rates, which deals with style and creating different movements and vibes and things like that. And hopefully this background knowledge is going to help you create better videos, animations, visual effects. At least you're a little bit smarter than you were before you started this video. If you like this video and you want to learn more about things like composition, color theory, different video editing techniques, then you might want to hit that subscribe button and ding that post notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the super dope stuff that we got planned. And also in the meantime, you can check out some of the older videos we got on the channel, which covers all sorts of different visual effects techniques and tips that are going to help save you time on your projects, whether that's animating or shooting videos. Oh, also let us know down below in the comments what's your favorite frame rate to use, because I'm sure that I'm going to enjoy reading it as well as the others in the community. Also, a huge thanks to everyone who has been supporting the channel, keeping it alive. This channel honestly would not be possible if it wasn't thanks to all of you who's joined our channel memberships or hit like on the videos or even sent it off to your friends or shared it with your classmates and whatnot. It's been a huge honor getting to make these videos for this awesome community of learners. And as always, I hope to catch you on the next one. Peace. Will you be here for the like part?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Quiet on set and rolling. I'm just gonna take it from the top in case. What's up?